Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.
To me, that history provides me with optimism for the very reason you're saying. I make one of the points, the authors of the Constitution did not put the right to vote in the Constitution, other than for Congress. But there is no grant of the right to vote. And I said in the book, it's fortunate they didn't, because if they would have, it would have been white males with property. And then you'd have to amend the Constitution to have progress. So we've had a tremendous amount of progress.
That's today's guest on Sidebar, David F. Walbert, author of Stealing Elections American Style.
Sidebar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, and Empire College of Law, located in Santa Rosa.
Welcome to Sidebar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your host, Mitch Winnick.
I am very delighted today to have David F. Walbert as our guest. David has litigated dozens of election cases, including landmark cases before the United States Supreme Court. He's taught constitutional law, something he and I share, and testified before Congress on voting legislation. We are really excited today to talk with him about his new book, which will be coming out September 3rd by Bloomsbury Publishers, called Stealing Elections American Style. I think by the title alone, you can understand why this is such a timely topic for us today here on Sidebar, Optimism in Action. David, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Mitch.
Before we get into the book, let's talk a little about your background, because our podcast is Optimism in Action, and I see from your bio that you were a civil rights lawyer. Tell us about that.
Sure. I was with the Georgia Legal Services Program, which is a brand new poverty law organization. And it was a great group started by a remarkable woman, Betty Carer. It was extraordinary because we were encouraged to try and do everything we could within our capacity to improve the lives of poor people in Georgia. And these people had never had lawyers before, not surprisingly. And it was a real shock to a lot of people to have these people being represented. But it was frustrating, too, because I could see that it was very hard to have a real impact. But one thing that struck me very early on, as soon as I got here, really, Georgia, by the early mid-'70s, voter registration, which had, 10, 20 years before had been awful racially, had been substantially rectified. So there was very similar levels of registration between black and white voters. But in terms of elected officials, it was extraordinary difference. I used to say I knew every single African-American elected to office in Georgia, not because I was necessarily so personable, because I could count them on my hands. And there was over 3,000 elected officials in Georgia, that time still is. There were maybe a dozen, really, at most, black elected officials at that point in time. So all the work I'd been trying to do to address community deficiencies and municipal services discrimination, it became pretty obvious that a much better remedy, if I could figure one out, was to change who's elected. And the reason black people were so excluded from the political process, I'll use the first case I tried as an example. It was Albany, Georgia. Albany, Georgia was about 35% African-American voters at that time, and they had never elected a single city commissioner. And the reason was every single city commissioner was elected at large by the 65% white majority. So they could pick every single commissioner, and they did. Black folk who ran never could get elected. That case was kind of a paradigm. I actually showed in that case how Albany had changed its method of election in 1947, and that's a critical date in Southern history because the white primary was the rule before then. Black people were not allowed to vote, period. And the Supreme Court had upheld it. They were excluded from the white primary, and the Supreme Court had said, well, that's just politics. That's just private conduct. So it wasn't until 1946 that was changed. And then Albany changed its voting to make sure that the black majority in a couple of wards couldn't control the outcome. And that's how I got into voting. It was great because it's not oftentimes a lawyer can bring a case and you can actually see real, tangible results that impact the community. But by integrating those city commissions, it really made a difference. In the long run, I actually think the biggest difference is that black and white kids started growing up understanding and seeing in their minds that political power is shared.
In listening to that story, which of course I find just fascinating, in the most recent Voting Rights Act case, which now we're only talking about weeks ago, it seemed like this current Supreme Court was using a similar analysis, but it was coming out with a different impact. And since you've been focusing on impact for what's now 100 years of this law, I think I'm hearing a repeat of the process, but the outcome is different?
To me, the court today is following in the footsteps of the courts from 1900, specifically in this sense, Mitch. Congress has the explicit authority under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to pass appropriate legislation to effectuate the purposes of those laws. And in the civil rights cases, the court says, well, this is beyond the power of Congress. The Supreme Court just did the same thing. It's kind of a little bit more deceitful, I guess, the way the current court is doing it, because it says, well, the facts are different. The world has changed, and here are the real facts. And the problem with that is they have no authority to do that under the Constitution. The Congress is empowered to effectuate the legislation, and the Constitution explicitly says to Congress, you have the responsibility to pass legislation that will effectuate these statutes. I would hope the Congress people know a whole lot more about politics than the people on the Supreme Court. That's what they do for a living. But the similarity would be the way the court has gutted congressional legislation. We are right back to 1900 in terms of what the court is doing. The tragedy is John Roberts was the most, I guess, rabid or dedicated lawyer in the Justice Department fighting against the expansion of the Voting Rights Act. He hated the idea of Congress passing a meaningful Voting Rights Act, period. His views really haven't changed a lick. He was as opposed to a Voting Rights Act in 1982 and 1981 as he is in his recent opinions. He just finally got in a position where he could overrule Congress.
And do you think there's an element of timing where we have a Congress, because of the very narrow margins, Congress is really frozen and unable to pass meaningful legislation, and that this has given the court the opportunity to be even more impactful in these kind of decisions, knowing that it's unlikely that Congress would come back around and revise to fit the structure the court defines?
Well, I think your point is very good, and I think it's even more dramatic if you go back to the Shelby case in 2013. Roberts wrote that opinion, and it was so devious because he did not say that the Voting Rights Act or Section 5 is unconstitutional. He said the formula by which Section 5 is applied to certain states and counties is unconstitutional. And he said, well, that may have been a good formula in 1965 when it was passed. All he did there, Mitch, was to try and lay the blame off of the court and put it on Congress, knowing full well that Congress could not come up and agree to a formula. It was a complete charade. And it was a charade to make it look like we're not striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It's Congress's mistake. They just have to cure it.
Let me transition for just a second, because you were also touching on the issue of districting and redistricting. They were citywide, countywide, statewide elections where the majority always overwhelmed the minority until we had single-member districts that clearly reflected the demographics. What we've now seen is the court weigh in on redistricting in a manner that said it's perfectly okay if you gerrymander districts based on party as long as you don't touch on race. It seems to me like what you just described as a disingenuous way to get to an end by the court was just similarly done on the issue of redistricting. Is that a fair assessment?
It's probably too kind. It's certainly accurate, but I mean, the way the court has got it set up is that a legislature can intentionally legislate its districts and draw districts intentionally to be fair to any group except a racial group. Like you say, it could gerrymander against Democrats, Republicans politically, but it could also intentionally be fair. It could also be very fair to rural versus urban interests or rich versus poor. It can intentionally draw its districts on the basis of anything, but the legislature cannot even draw districts with race in mind in order to be fair. That's borderline insane when you think of the fact that why did we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment? This so-called colorblind theory they've come up with, they've taken the amendments to the Constitution and turned them on their head so that instead of empowering racial protection, it now prohibits it. And even though the legislatures are authorized and legally can intentionally district on any other basis.
I can't resist asking one more thing along this line. I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say. But here we had the person who's the Supreme Court Justice who says he's the originalist. I'm talking of Clarence Thomas. He appears to use that when it's convenient for every argument that he wants to make. And yet he made the argument that in his opinion, the originalist interpretation is that the origin of the Voting Rights Act was entirely limited to slavery and was never intended to be projected forward into contemporary times. Is that possible?
It's not, but it's hard to psychoanalyze somebody from afar. But it seems to me that he's got what he wants. And I'll tell you that watching him in the voting rights cases, he's a literalist whenever it's convenient. And in the voting rights cases, it's just staggering because he will say, in addition to what you just said, Mitch, if the statute, no matter what it says about if any election system results in discrimination, and it's crystal clear, but he will say, oh, all it says is if you can go and cast a ballot, that's it, even under the Voting Rights Act, which is impossible for an honest person to say that when you read the statute. It's hard to come up with adjectives that are both accurate and not too incendiary.
Support for Optimism in Action comes from the Monterey College of Law, a nonprofit law school serving the Monterey Bay region with evening classes on campus or in a hybrid online format. More details and applications available at montereylaw.edu. That's montereylaw.edu.
So let's talk about your book, Stealing Elections American Style. I think there's a viewpoint that we see right there in the title. Tell us about why you wrote the book and give us some highlights about the book that will help us understand where we are and where are we going in the future.
Well, I wrote the book because I was really getting both frustrated and angry, I guess, in recent years, watching how the clock was being turned back. So from 75 for the next 25 years for sure, there was a tremendous amount of improvement on the election and political side. I could tell you stories about the Georgia General Assembly after the 2000 election and just how it was the most racially copacetic, excellent environment I've ever seen anywhere. It was just really remarkable. And it was because the election system had evolved to the point where black and white Democrats shared power and they had to depend on one another to make it all work. It was beautiful to behold. But right around that time, you start seeing Republicans that are trying to revert the law and make it harder to vote because they see the future being more minority voters voting Democratic, and they're going to be in trouble. But when 2013 hit, 2013 being the magic year when Shelby's decided by the Supreme Court, and the first chunk of the Voting Rights Act is erased, then things really got nutty. You started seeing every kind of voter suppression law coming in. So the possibility of me doing something as a lawyer about these regressions in voting was getting pretty difficult because the Supreme Court's erasing the law one after another. And you knew the future was going to be equally bad. So I decided I wanted to write this book, and I wanted to write it not because I wanted to just say, here's the problem. I didn't want it to write it just to lawyers or political scientists or professors. I wanted it to be a book that general readers could really get a lot out of, but also really enjoy. And so it's a combination of really fascinating stories, literally stories, of stolen elections. Lyndon Johnson's 2 stolen Senate elections in the 40s. I start with Tilden Hayes from 1876. And honest to God, you can't make that stuff up. It's really extraordinary. I go into Bush v. Gore in detail, and everybody knows about the Supreme Court decision, but there's an awful lot else that went into that election that, in terms of voter suppression and voter purges beforehand, that is equally bad as what the Supreme Court did. I've got on my wall over here the signed dissents of the 4 dissenters from Bush versus Gore, Stevens and Souter and Ginsburg and Breyer. I think in the long run, that's going to be one of the most important decisions in our history.
You talk about a long period of time, really starting in late 1800s. There were a lot of fluctuations in the way the laws were written, the laws were applied, the courts reacted to it. As much as I may not like where we are right now in the current interpretation the court is putting out, couldn't you look at history and say, well, there have been a lot of times where it swayed positive and negative, and yet so many of those times we rebounded as a country. You talked about Georgia and hitting this point where it was this very rewarding sense of a balance of fairness. This has historically been an element of the American democratic story. Going forward, does it help us predict the future?
Well, to me, that history provides me with optimism for the very reason you're saying. I make one of the points, the authors of the Constitution did not put the right to vote in the Constitution, other than for Congress. But there is no grant of the right to vote. And I said in the book, it's fortunate they didn't, because if they would have, it would have been white males with property. And then you'd have to amend the Constitution to have progress. So we've had a tremendous amount of progress. The story of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote, and really what the suffragette organization, in my opinion, I say in the book, I think it's the most extraordinarily capable political effort getting that amendment passed that has ever happened in this country. It's extraordinary what they did. Must have been first introduced in the Congress 30 or 40 years before it got voted out. And then when it finally got voted out in 1919, the goal was to get it ratified for the 1920 presidential election. The effort that was made to do that, and the structure and the state-by-state organizations that existed to make that happen, is an extraordinary political story, a wonderful political story. And to your point, it's a wonderfully uplifting story, and it's part of our history. What is going on today, and I mean, Donald Trump is certainly a unique character in American history, and his desire and willingness to manipulate the voting system in order to win is unprecedented. But I believe that it just can't go on and on. People are going to get disgusted with that at some point. It has gone so far. Yes, we've had gerrymandering, and I got a chapter on our history of gerrymandering, and it goes all the way back. And I'm telling you, Mitch, with AI, I can see the future on that. It's going to get much uglier, where you can really draw districts that are going to give you just what you want, number one. And number two, you can change those districts every couple of years, too, if you've got something else you want to do with them. But the data that is available out there on a house-by-house basis on who you are, that they don't know who you vote for, but boy, they can darn near tell you who you're going to vote for by looking at what you subscribe to, your buying habits, and so on. And the house-by-house data that is available commercially is staggering. And when that's merged with AI for redistricting, whether that happens after the next census or later, I don't know, but it's going to happen. And people are going to just get so disgusted with it. I think at some point we will end up getting rid of the political gerrymandering we're watching that's in the extreme this year. I hope. I'm optimistic.
David, I'm not going to go any further because I want everybody to buy the book. I'm convinced this is just a wonderful opportunity in one place for a reader to be able to get a combination of history and the law as it's relating to exactly what we're seeing in the weeks leading up to the midterm elections in November. So this is perfect timing. Your book comes out first week of September. Go to Bloomsbury, BLOOMSBURY.com. They can pre-order the book right now and then have it sent to them in time to read it before the election in November.
I appreciate those comments. The last chapter, which I wrote last fall, is titled The Next Stolen Election. And unfortunately, it's turned out to be pretty prescient so far. It's a fun read. I've made it intentionally to not be a heavy tome. It's a good read.
David, this has been delightful. This is as interesting as I thought it would be. I could go on asking questions about your historical perspective and all of the variations that have gone through election law over the decades, but I'm going to leave it with this, that everyone should read Stealing Elections, American Style, and think hard about how that will impact not only the way you vote, but the way you think about the voting process. Because at the end of the day, that is the optimism you spoke to, which is we do have impact on how the system will work in the state legislature as well as in Congress. And it does turn back around to be on us. Thank you, David. We appreciate you being a guest today.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to Sidebar, Optimism in Action. For more episodes and information, go to sidebarmedia.org. That's sidebarmedia.org.
Sidebar would not be possible without our producer, David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on Sidebar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates Sidebar's social media marketing.
Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.